The bell above the diner door had barely stopped ringing when Elena saw him. Snow still clung to his hair and shoulders, melting into dark patches on the torn fabric of his coat, leaving a small puddle at his feet. He moved like someone who wasn't sure if he was allowed to exist in a warm place, eyes down, arms pressed close to his chest. Christmas garlands and blinking lights framed him cruelly, as if the room itself were celebrating around his misery. From behind the counter, Elena felt something tighten in her chest, a quiet pull that had nothing to do with tips or orders. She balanced a plate on her hand, eggs, toast, a little bacon, the simple breakfast that was supposed to be her first real meal of the day. The manager's voice still rang in her ears from a few minutes earlier. No free refills, no free food, no charity, not today of all days. Elena had nodded then, but now, looking at the stranger huddled in the corner booth, those words felt heavier than the plate itself. His hands trembled as he tried to warm them against the side of an empty coffee cup someone had left behind. No one looked his way. They talked louder, as if ignoring him required extra noise. Elena set the plate down on the steel counter just within reach, and for a heartbeat she stood there, caught between rules and conscience. Her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since the night before, a dull burn that made the smell of bacon almost painful. She thought of her son at home, still asleep with his worn-out stuffed bear, waiting for a Christmas that she knew would be far too simple. Then she imagined those same eyes on this man's face, hungry, ashamed, invisible. Something in her gave way, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of a mother who has already chosen. Before she could talk herself out of it, Elena picked up the plate and walked toward the corner booth. The man tried to stand, to apologize for sitting there, but his voice cracked and his knees looked weak. "It's okay," she murmured, her own voice barely more than a breath, as she set the food in front of him. His hands shook so much he could hardly hold the fork, so she gently steadied his fingers, then lifted a piece of toast toward his lips, like a mother feeding a child who had forgotten how to eat. Tears spilled down his cheeks, not just from hunger, but from the shock of being seen. That was the moment the diner went silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. A chair scraped the floor, sharp as a knife, and Elena didn't need to turn to know who it was. The manager's shadow fell over the table, cutting through the soft glow of the Christmas lights. His voice exploded through the room, full of outrage and pride, calling her a thief, calling the man trash, calling this place a business, not a shelter. In front of strangers and clinking dishes and blinking lights, he fired her with a single brutal sentence, and the plate slipped from her hands, food scattering across the floor like a final offering. Outside, a few minutes later, the cold bit through Elena's thin coat, as snowflakes landed on her empty hands where the plate had been. And on that bitter Christmas morning, she believed she had just lost everything, unaware that this was the very moment when her whole life had quietly begun to change. The sound of the manager's voice still rang in Elena's ears as the door closed behind her with a dull thud. Out here, the world was strangely quiet, the street muffled under a fresh blanket of snow that swallowed every noise. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, her breath coming out in short white bursts, fingers numb inside thin, frayed gloves. Behind her, the diner windows glowed warm and yellow, like a life she no longer belonged to. With one last glance at the man in the corner booth, she turned away, the wind pushing gently against her back, as if urging her to move. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step a reminder that she had no reason to go back the next day. Cars passed with fogged windows and Christmas songs faintly leaking from their radios, but no one looked at the woman trudging through the slush with her shoulders hunched. Storefronts were dressed in fake snow and cheerful signs, promising sales and joy that seemed meant for other people, not for someone counting coins at the bottom of her purse. Elena hugged her coat closer, feeling the thin fabric fail to keep out the cold. Somewhere, a church bell chimed the late morning hour, soft and distant, like a prayer she had forgotten the words to. By the time she reached her building, her toes burned with cold and her cheeks felt raw. The stairwell smelled faintly of dust and old cooking oil, familiar and strangely comforting after the bright, greasy air of the diner. She paused outside her door, listening for the small, steady sound she loved most in the world. From inside came the soft hum of a cartoon on low volume and the uneven little footsteps of her son playing alone. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, forcing her mouth into something that might pass for a smile before turning the key. "Mom?" he called, running to her with his stuffed bear tucked under one arm, hair sticking up in all directions. The apartment was warm but dim, the only decoration a paper garland he had made at school, drooping slightly over the kitchen doorway. On the wall near the table, a hand-drawn Christmas card read, "To the best Mom," the letters uneven and proud. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat as she scooped him into a hug, burying her face in his hair that smelled of soap and crayons. She told him the diner had been very busy, that she was just tired, that everything was fine, lies wrapped carefully around a truth too heavy for small shoulders. Later, when he sat at the table colouring, Eleanor heated leftover pasta in a dented pot, the watery sauce bubbling half-heartedly on the stove. This was their Christmas meal now. No turkey, no dessert. Just enough to fill 2 plates, if she served his a little fuller than hers. She watched him eat with the seriousness of a child who knows not to complain, then smiled weakly when he slid a crooked red heart toward her on the paper. When he finally fell asleep on the couch, still clutching his bear, she turned off the TV and sat in the quiet, the snow tapping softly against the window. In that thin silence, with no one watching and no customers to serve, Elena let herself wonder for the first time if kindness had been a mistake she simply could not afford. A few weeks before that bitter Christmas morning, the diner felt almost like a second home to Elena, even with its flickering lights and sticky floors. The bell above the door sang the same tired tune each time a regular walked in, and she knew most of them by their favorite orders and the stories they told when the coffee was fresh. The smell of bacon, burnt toast, and cheap cologne blended into something oddly comforting, like a life that wasn't perfect but was at least predictable. Elena moved between tables with a practiced grace, balancing plates and small jokes, saving her real smiles for the moments when someone said, "Thank you," and actually meant it. Back then, she still believed that if she just kept going, things would eventually get better. On slow mornings, she would rest her hand for a second on the tip jar, feeling the coins rattling against the glass like tiny promises. Hidden beneath a folded napkin, safe from greasy fingers and stray splashes of coffee, was a small photo of her son, grinning with all his baby teeth. When no one was looking, she would lift the napkin just enough to see his face, as if reminding herself what every tired step was for. She told the other waitresses that one day she would save enough to move them out of that cramped apartment, maybe even sign up for night classes. They laughed and shook their heads, calling her a dreamer, but their eyes softened in a way that told her they wanted to believe it too. The manager, even then, was not a kind man, but he wrapped his sharpness in fake politeness as long as customers were watching. He talked about company policy and efficiency like sacred texts, rolling his eyes when Elena stopped to chat with old Mrs. Davenport or refilled a coffee cup one time too many without charging. Still, he kept his voice low and his smile neat, warning her in the back room instead of in front of the whole diner. "You're not paid to care, Eleanor," he would say, straightening his tie in the reflection of the freezer door. She would nod, bite her tongue, and then go back out to do exactly what he told her not to do, care. One chilly afternoon, as wind rattled the windows and a light dusting of snow began to cling to the sidewalk, A man in an expensive dark coat pushed open the diner door. He didn't look like he belonged there among chipped mugs and laminated menus. His shoes were too polished, his scarf too soft, his eyes too alert. Eleanor noticed how he scanned the room, not like someone choosing a seat, but like someone taking stock. He sat at the counter rather than a booth, ordered a simple black coffee, and watched the manager with an intensity that made the air feel different somehow. From behind the counter, Elena felt a flicker of unease, as if a page had turned in a book she hadn't finished reading. While he stirred his coffee, barely tasting it, the man began to ask questions that had nothing to do with the menu. He wanted to know how long the diner had been open, who owned it, how many employees worked there, whether it was profitable in a town like this. The manager, suddenly all smiles and charm, answered eagerly, bragging about cutting costs and keeping staff in line. Elena pretended to wipe down the counter while listening, her hand tightening around the damp cloth as she sensed something shifting beneath the surface of her ordinary day. When the stranger's gaze briefly met hers, steady and unreadable, she felt a ripple of cold curiosity down her spine, and had no idea that this quiet conversation was the first tremor of the earthquake that would soon tear her life apart. Miles away from the chipped mugs and squeaky booths of the diner, a very different kind of table stretched beneath bright ceiling lights. It was long, polished and cold, set not with plates and cutlery but with laptops, reports, and bottles of imported water lined up like soldiers. At the head of that table sat the same man who had once walked into the diner in his immaculate coat. Only now the coat was gone, and the mask of importance was back in place. His name was Adrian Cole, heir to a sprawling chain of hotels and restaurants that glittered on billboards and travel websites. Around him, executives spoke in confident tones about numbers and projections, while Adrian stared at a spreadsheet he could barely see. They were talking about closures again. One city, then another, then another. Each location reduced to a line on a chart, its story flattened into columns of red and black. Underperforming, someone said, tapping a screen with manicured nails. Dead weight, another added, sliding a file across the table. No one mentioned the cooks who knew every regular's favorite dish, the waitresses who worked Christmas mornings, the dishwashers with 2 jobs and no insurance. Adrian heard the words and felt them land somewhere just behind his ribs, heavy and bitter. The food catered for the meeting remained untouched, steaming quietly at the side of the room, a feast for no one. He had grown up around this kind of talk, acquisitions, restructures, strategic pivots. As a boy, he had been told that their family created opportunities, that they provided jobs, that success justified the hard decisions. Yet, somewhere along the way, the stories about people had been replaced by charts about profit, and Adrian had realized that most of the faces smiling at him were attached to outstretched hands. He could remember every time someone had called him friend, with a tone that really meant benefactor, every conversation that seemed warm until money wasn't on the table anymore. With each passing year, his fortune grew, and his sense of being truly seen shrank to almost nothing. Lately, sleep had become a stranger. He lay awake at night in a bed large enough for a whole family, staring at the dark and wondering when exactly his life had begun to feel so hollow. He had money, properties, staff, a calendar full of meetings, but not one person he trusted to sit with him in silence when the noise in his head grew too loud. He felt like a man drowning in clear water. Everyone could see him, but no one believed he was in danger because from the outside everything looked fine. In that quiet desperation, he began to ask himself a question he never said aloud. If he lost the name, the suits, the fortune, would anyone still offer him a chair at their table? It was that restless thought that led him, almost on impulse, to trace his finger along a map and circle a small, unremarkable town where one of their older diners still struggled to stay afloat. He told his board he needed time away, framed it as a sabbatical, a mental health break, something fashionable and acceptable among people who scheduled their emotions. In truth, Adrian wanted to disappear, not into luxury, but into anonymity. He would go there without his wealth, without his polished shoes, without the armor of his last name. He wanted to know if kindness still existed in a world where his money had distorted every relationship he touched. As the jet prepared to take him towards snow and cheap coffee and fluorescent lights, he had no idea that one tired waitress in a red uniform would soon become the only proof he had left that humanity wasn't entirely for sale. In the days leading up to Christmas, the diner seemed to grow colder, even when the grill was hot and the coffee pots were full. The decorations went up slowly, a faded wreath on the door, a plastic Santa near the register, but there was no warmth in the way they were hung. Elena noticed that the staff meal, once a simple comfort at the end of a long shift, quietly disappeared from the schedule. "New policy," the manager announced, without looking anyone in the eye. "If you want to eat, you buy like everyone else." The words fell like small stones, not enough to break anything outright, but enough to bruise. Her hours started shrinking too, almost imperceptibly at first. One evening, she checked the new schedule and saw her name marked in red, a neat line drawn through a shift she'd been counting on. "Slow week," the manager said when she asked, shrugging as if it were out of his hands. But somehow his own hours remained untouched and his overtime grew. Elena smiled politely, said she understood, then walked home doing the math in her head, rent, groceries, her son's worn shoes with the split sole she had promised to replace before the snow got worse. Each erased shift was another knot tightening around her chest. Customers felt the difference too, though most couldn't name it. The music played a little softer, the smiles from the staff a little thinner. When an older man lingered over his coffee one morning, clearly lonely, Elena found herself topping up his cup without writing it on the ticket. The manager watched from the counter, jaw tight, and called her over later to scold her in a low, clipped tone. "You're not here to be their friend," he said. "Every refill is money." She apologized, staring at the floor. But inside she felt something crack, like a hairline fracture in glass that no one notices until it finally shatters. At home, the changes showed up in small, painful ways. She watered down the soup a little more than usual, split one chicken breast between them, and pretended she preferred extra vegetables. When her son pointed at a toy in a store window, eyes wide with hope, she joked that Santa was on a budget this year and steered him gently away. He didn't complain, just slipped his hand into hers and squeezed as if he sensed more than she could say. Late at night, when he slept, she spread the bills out on the table and tried to stretch numbers that refused to stretch any further, tracing the due dates with trembling fingers. Yet, even as the pressure built, Elena clung to the belief that if she simply worked harder, smiled more, and made herself indispensable, the tides would turn. She circled Christmas week on the calendar at home, whispering to herself that holiday tips might help her catch up, that January would be kinder. In the diner, she kept moving with practiced grace, refilling cups and remembering favorite orders, trying to be the kind of employee no one would want to lose. What she didn't know was that decisions had already been made about who mattered and who was replaceable, and that Christmas morning would not bring the relief she prayed for, but the breaking point she never saw coming. Christmas morning began not with carols for Elena, but with the hiss of the bus doors and the sting of cold air on her face. The town still slept under a soft white blanket, but the diner lights were already on, buzzing against the grey sky like a tired promise. Inside, the floor felt stickier than usual, the coffee a little more bitter, as if the whole place resented being awake so early. Elena hung her thin coat on the same hook as always and tied her red apron with fingers that had almost forgotten what it was like not to ache. She told herself that today, of all days, she needed to avoid mistakes. The manager was already pacing near the register, suit pressed, hair slicked back, a nervous energy humming just beneath his smugness. He gathered the staff with a clap of his hands, his smile stretched tight. "Listen up," he said, voice sharp enough to cut. "We could have important eyes on us today, investors, inspectors, people who matter. So there will be no freebies, no sympathy, no nonsense. This is a business, not a charity. Anyone giving away food pays for it themselves or doesn't work here anymore." His gaze lingered on Elena, a heartbeat longer than on anyone else, as if the warning were carved especially for her. As the morning crowd trickled in, families in Christmas sweaters, couples clutching paper-wrapped gifts, truckers grateful for a hot meal, Elena moved between tables with the quiet grace of habit. She refilled coffee without being asked, offered extra napkins, remembered how Mrs. Jensen liked her toast almost burnt, "Don't be shy." Each small act of care felt a little more dangerous under the manager's watchful eyes. When she caught him staring, arms folded, chin lifted in pride at how tightly he controlled his tiny kingdom, she lowered her gaze and bit back the urge to remind him that people, not policies, filled the chairs. Hunger gnawed at her as the hours passed, a dull ache that turned the smell of frying bacon into something almost cruel. In theory, she had a staff breakfast waiting, a simple plate she looked forward to more than any wrapped gift. But the rush never seemed to slow enough for her to sit. She thought of her son, waking up to a small toy and a kiss on the forehead, instead of the pile of presents other children boasted about. She imagined him wondering if Santa had lost their address again, and the thought left a hollow space in her chest that no coffee could fill. Her own untouched plate cooled quietly on the counter, a small luxury she kept pushing aside. Outside, beyond the fogged windows, snow fell in soft, endless sheets, blurring the lines between sky and street. At one point, as Elena wiped down a table near the door, she glimpsed a figure across the road, hunched, slow-moving, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather. Just another stranger, she told herself, turning back to her work, though something about the way he paused under the diner's sign tugged at the edge of her attention. The bell above the door had not yet rung, the morning had not yet broken open, and Eleanor still believed that if she simply followed the rules, she could keep the fragile life she had built. She had no idea how close she stood to the one decision that would strip everything away and quietly begin to give it all back. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle as it swung shut behind the stranger, wind chasing him in like an unwelcome guest. Snow clung to his hair and lashes, his coat soaked through and hanging off his shoulders as if it had given up on keeping him warm. He moved to the farthest corner booth, the one half hidden beneath a plastic Christmas wreath, and sank into the seat with the slow, unsteady motion of someone who hadn't rested in a long time. Customers glanced his way, took in the torn sleeves and worn shoes, then quickly looked back at their plates as if eye contact might cost them something. Only Elena kept watching, a knot tightening in her chest. Her own breakfast sat cooling on the counter, eggs going rubbery, toast losing its crunch, the small strip of bacon stiffening at the edges. She had promised herself she would sit for 5 minutes, just 5, before the next rush. But now, as she watched the man wrap his arms around himself, hands trembling in the sleeves of that thin coat, her appetite dissolved into something that felt like shame. He didn't order. He didn't even ask for water. He just stared at the empty table in front of him, Adam's apple bobbing, as though he were swallowing prayers that never made it past his throat. Eleanor could feel the manager's warning echoing in her head. No charity, no freebies, not today. Still, there was another voice, softer but stronger, that had lived inside her far longer than any job. It sounded like her grandmother telling stories about sharing the last piece of bread, like her son asking why some kids at school never had enough lunch. Her stomach cramped in protest as she picked up the plate that was supposed to be hers, the smell of bacon rising like one last temptation. For a moment she just stood there, fingers curled around the edge of the porcelain, heart pounding, caught between fear of losing everything and fear of becoming the kind of person who looked away. She chose. Quietly, without announcement or apology, Elena walked to the corner booth and set the plate down in front of the man. His eyes snapped up, wide and disbelieving, as if he'd been waking from a long, cold dream. "It's for you," she said softly, the words almost lost beneath the clatter of dishes and the murmur of other people's Christmas mornings. His hands shook so badly he couldn't lift the fork, so she wrapped her fingers gently around his and steadied them, guiding the first bite to his lips. Tears welled and spilled down his cheeks, carving clean tracks through the grime on his face, not just from hunger, but from the unbearable weight of being treated like a human being. The diner fell silent in stages, conversation thinning into whispers, then fading into the hum of the heaters and the faint Christmas song playing from a dusty speaker. A chair scraped hard against the floor, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Elena didn't need to turn to know the manager was behind her. She felt his anger before she heard his voice. It crashed over her in front of everyone. Accusations of theft, of feeding trash, of undermining the business on the busiest day of the year. He snatched the plate from the table, sending food skidding across the floor, and with a single sharp sentence he fired her. The word terminated ringing louder than the bell above the door. As the room watched, some with judgment and some with shame, the man she had just fed looked up at her with eyes full of something fierce and unfinished. A look that would follow her long after she stepped into the snow, jobless and hungry, believing this was the end when it was only the beginning. The days that followed Christmas blurred together like dirty snow melting at the edge of the sidewalk. Morning after morning, Elena, dressed in her neatest blouse and the same worn shoes, walking from shop to shop with a stack of printed resumes that grew more wrinkled with every door that closed in her face. "We are not hiring," they said. "Maybe next month." Some took her paper with a polite smile. Others barely glanced at it before sliding it into a drawer she knew would never be opened. By the time the sun dipped low, her feet throbbed, and the cold had worked its way into her bones. But going home with nothing felt heavier than the wind. At first, the rejections were wrapped in vague excuses, but soon the truth began to show at the edges. A manager at a cafe hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I'm sorry," she murmured, leaning closer. "I've heard things. Your old boss says you stole food, caused a scene. He told people you're unstable." The word landed like a stone in Elena's stomach. She thanked the woman anyway, walked outside on legs that felt hollow, and stood still on the sidewalk while cars and people moved around her like water. Somewhere, behind bright windows and steaming cups, he was still talking, undoing her name in places she hadn't yet walked into. Back at the apartment, the evidence of her new reality waited on the small kitchen table. Bills lay in uneven stacks: rent, electricity, gas, the medical bill from her son's last fever when she'd sworn things would be different this year. The landlord's latest note was tucked under the doorframe, written in impatient, heavy strokes. "Past due, last warning." Elena read it twice, then folded it carefully as if neat edges could soften hard words. The fridge hummed softly behind her, half-empty shelves, offering little more than eggs, a few potatoes, and a jar of peanut butter scraped nearly clean. She calculated meals in her head, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. When evening settled over the building, the dim hallway light flickered, and the apartment grew quieter than she liked. To save on the electric bill, she turned off the overhead lamp and lit a single candle. its small flame painting gentle shadows on the peeling walls. Her son sat cross-legged on the floor with his toy cars, making soft engine noises under his breath, blissfully unaware of the numbers marching across the overdue notices. "Are we okay, Mom?" he asked once, looking up with big, searching eyes. She smiled, smoothed his hair and said, "We're together. That's what matters," even as fear tugged at the corners of her heart. Later, when he was asleep, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm that had always soothed her, Elena sat alone at the table with the candle burned low. Hands clasped, elbows pressed against the cool wood, she bowed her head without ceremony, without perfect words. She didn't ask for riches or miracles, only for enough strength not to break in front of her boy, enough light to see one step ahead in the dark. The apartment was so quiet she could hear the tick of the cheap clock on the wall and the distant murmur of a neighbor's television. As the flame trembled and wax pooled around the base, she wondered, with a tired ache, if the world had already forgotten the moment she chose compassion over survival, and if anyone anywhere still remembered the woman who gave away her only breakfast on Christmas morning. Morning came not with good news, but with the familiar rattle of pipes and the thin light seeping through the threadbare curtains. Elena woke to the feeling of weight pressing on her chest, the same invisible stone that had followed her from one failed interview to the next. For a moment she lay still, listening to the soft breaths of her son in the next room, tempted to close her eyes and pretend the world could wait. But then small footsteps padded across the floor, and a sleepy voice whispered, "Mom?" She sat up quickly, smoothing her hair and forcing a smile that she hoped looked more like courage than exhaustion. He climbed onto the edge of her mattress with his stuffed bear, studying her face in the way children sometimes do when they're trying to read a language they don't yet know. "You were crying last night," he said simply, without accusation, just quiet observation. Elena looked away, her throat tightening, and then pulled him into her arms. "I just miss better days," she answered, choosing each word carefully, not wanting to say money or job or fear. He thought for a moment, then wriggled free and ran to the little table by the window where his crayons waited in a chipped cup. While she made thin oatmeal on the stove, stretching the milk as far as it would go, he sat at the table, drawing with fierce concentration. The apartment was cold enough that their breath puffed faintly in the air, but his small hand moved steadily across the paper, filling it with bright strokes of color that defied the gray morning. When he finally turned the page around, she saw a house, bigger than theirs, with yellow windows glowing like warmth itself, and two small figures standing in front holding hands. Above them, in uneven letters, he had written, "Me and Mom." Something in her chest cracked open, not with pain this time, but with a slow, aching tenderness. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment, barely audible over the simmering pot. Eleanor hesitated, heart skipping, half afraid it would be the landlord, with yet another warning. Instead, when she opened the door, she found Mrs. Ramirez from down the hall, wrapped in a faded sweater, her kind eyes taking in the scene with one long, knowing glance. "I made too much soup," the older woman lied gently, holding out a container that smelled of vegetables and chicken and something like mercy. "And if you ever need me to watch him while you look around, I'm here. No charge." The words were simple, but to Eleanor they felt like a hand offered to someone who had forgotten she was allowed to be helped. That afternoon, buoyed by the small kindness and her son's drawing folded carefully into her pocket, Eleanor forced herself out again into the cold. She followed a handwritten sign in a bakery window that read, "Part-time help needed," pushing the door open to a rush of warm air smelling of sugar and fresh bread. The owner, a tired woman with flour on her cheek, eyed her resume, but seemed more interested in the way Elena wiped her feet and greeted each customer who passed behind her. "You can try a few shifts," she said at last. "The pay's not much, but it's honest, and I don't care what your last boss said." As Elena tied on a borrowed apron, she overheard two customers chatting near the display case, their voices drifting over the clink of coffee cups. Some rich investor was coming to town, they said, planning to visit struggling restaurants and decide which ones were worth saving. The words lodged quietly in her mind, like a small, distant light she wasn't ready to name. At the old diner, the air felt different, charged with a nervous energy that even the buzzing lights couldn't drown out. Word had trickled down from someone at corporate. A major investor might be visiting soon, someone with the power to close the place or turn it into a shiny flagship. The staff didn't know what that really meant, only that the manager was suddenly more irritable, more watchful, more obsessed with fingerprints on silverware and smudges on glass. He walked the narrow aisles like a general inspecting troops before a battle, eyes sharp, jaw tight, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Do you understand what's at stake here?" he barked, though no one had dared to answer him yet. "If we impress him, this place could finally become something. If we don't—" His pause was deliberate, heavy, like a hand tightening around a throat. "There will be cuts, and I won't hesitate to start with anyone who makes me look bad." The other servers exchanged quick, wary glances, then bent their heads to polishing cutlery and scrubbing menus as if their lives depended on the shine. The manager's pride swelled with each command, as though the possibility of being noticed by someone powerful had made him taller overnight. The diner itself was scrubbed into a kind of artificial perfection. Windows that usually bore streaks of rain and fingerprints now gleamed so clearly they reflected the ghostly faces of the staff. The cracked salt shakers were replaced, the chipped mugs pushed to the back of the cupboard. Even the faded Christmas decorations were rearranged, tilted just so to look festive rather than tired. On the surface, it almost worked. The place looked cleaner, brighter, ready for inspection. But underneath that polish, a tightness coiled in every shoulder, every forced smile, every breath held just a second too long. Rumors about the investor had grown with each retelling. Some said he was ruthless, that he could shut down a restaurant with one raised eyebrow. Others whispered that he hated sentiment, that he fired managers who let their staff get soft or attached. The manager drank in these stories like fuel, repeating them with a twist that always ended in the same point. He, and he alone, understood how to run a real business. "This is our chance," he told anyone who would listen, though what he meant was my chance. In his mind, the visit had already become a stepping stone, a possible promotion, a door out of this small-town diner into something grander. As the day of the rumored visit crept closer, the tension tightened like a string pulled too far. Staff moved in quick, nervous bursts, laughter reduced to short, cautious huffs that died as soon as the manager appeared. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy, the kind that threatened more snow but hadn't yet decided when to let it fall. Inside, the only sound for a moment was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of a spoon in a coffee cup. Then the manager glanced at the clock, straightened his tie in the reflection of the spotless window, and fixed his stare on the door. Somewhere out there, a man with the power to reshape all their lives was drawing closer, and the diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the bell to ring. That evening, after her trial shift at the bakery, Elena trudged home with the smell of yeast and sugar still clinging to her clothes. Her feet ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that came with the fragile hope of maybe, just maybe, a steadier income. Her son greeted her at the door with a hug around her waist and a flurry of excited words about a school project and a story he'd written. After dinner, soup stretched with bread from the bakery she'd been allowed to bring home. He fell asleep early, his head heavy on her lap as she stroked his hair. The apartment dimmed into its usual quiet, the kind that could feel comforting or crushing depending on the day. She turned on the small old television, mostly for company, flipping through channels of game shows and reruns until a news anchor's calm voice filled the room. A headline at the bottom of the screen caught her eye. Heir to hospitality empire, seen again after weeks off the grid. Curiosity nudged her thumb off the remote button. The anchor spoke of a young billionaire who had abruptly stepped away from public life, sparking rumors of a breakdown, a spiritual crisis, or simply exhaustion from too much responsibility. Elena listened with half an ear, her attention drifting, until a photograph appeared on the screen. The image was crisp and polished, a man in a tailored suit, hair neatly styled, standing in front of a hotel logo. But it wasn't the suit or the hotel that made Eleanor sit up straighter. It was the eyes. Even behind the professional smile, they held a flicker of something she recognized. That same deep, restless sadness she had seen across the diner table the morning she gave away her breakfast. Her heart stumbled in her chest. She leaned forward, squinting, tracing the line of his jaw, the shape of his mouth, the way he angled his head slightly away from the camera. It couldn't be. It made no sense. And yet, something inside her whispered that it was him. The report cut from still photos to shaky video of the man walking quickly through an airport, trying to avoid cameras. In those brief, unposed seconds, the resemblance sharpened. There was the same hunched way of carrying himself, the same guarded look when someone got too close. Elena's pulse hammered in her ears. She fumbled for the remote and rewound the segment, watching it again, then again, as if a third viewing would prove her wrong and let her sleep easier. But each time, the feeling grew stronger, not weaker. The poor man she had fed on Christmas morning did not belong to the street. He belonged to a world she could barely imagine. And sources say, the anchor continued, unaware of the storm gathering in a small, dim apartment, that Adrian Cole has been seen traveling quietly through smaller towns, visiting properties his company owns. Today, reports place him in... Elena didn't hear the rest of the sentence at first, the air seeming to thin around her. When the town's name finally registered, her breath caught. It was her town, her streets, her cold sidewalks and flickering streetlights. She turned down the volume, staring at the moving image on the screen, that familiar, unfamiliar face, and felt a tremor of something she hadn't allowed herself in weeks. The sense that her story and his were not yet finished, and that whatever had begun with a plate of breakfast in a dingy diner was about to come back into her life in a way she could not yet begin to understand. The day of the visit dawned grey and flat, the kind of sky that made it hard to tell what time it truly was. At the diner, the manager had arrived early, prowling from table to table with a cloth in one hand and a look of grim determination on his face. Every sugar packet was aligned, every napkin holder filled to the brim, every menu wiped until the plastic squeaked. "Remember," he repeated as if the words were a spell, "this man can make or break us. I don't want to see a single mistake, not one." The staff nodded, shoulders tight, pretending not to notice that his hands shook slightly when he checked his watch. By mid-morning, the place felt like a stage set just before the curtain rose. The usual clutter of everyday life had been smoothed over. No chipped mugs, no mismatched plates, no lingering customers talking too long over cold coffee. The manager had turned away anyone who looked even slightly disheveled, telling them the kitchen was backed up, while secretly saving the booths for whoever might come in with money and power. The Christmas lights still blinked half-heartedly along the windows, but their cheer looked forced now, the festive garland suddenly more like a costume than a celebration. Underneath the surface shine, unease hummed like a low electric current. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, covering the parking lot in a thin, fresh layer that reflected the diner's neon sign. The manager stood near the entrance, straightening his tie for the third time in 10 minutes, rehearsing his greeting under his breath. In his mind, he saw handshakes, approval, maybe a promotion that would take him out of this town and into a corner office somewhere brighter. He imagined the investor as a mirror of his own ambition. Sharp eyes, hard lines, no patience for weakness. The staff watched him from behind the counter and coffee pots, sensing that whatever happened today would ripple far beyond clean windows and polished silverware. Then, at last, the bell above the door rang. The manager stepped forward, smile already fixed in place, words of welcome perched on his tongue. But the greeting died there, unfinished, as the man who stepped inside was not at all what he expected, and yet, to anyone who had been there on Christmas morning, heartbreakingly familiar. The coat was new, dark, and perfectly tailored. The shoes were polished, the shirt crisp, the tie understated and expensive. His hair was neatly cut, his jaw clean-shaven, his posture easy but controlled. Behind him, 2 assistants entered with tablets and calm, professional expressions. Yet beneath all that polish, his eyes were the same, searching, quiet, carrying the memory of cold and hunger. For a heartbeat, the diner seemed to forget how to breathe. A server near the coffee machine nearly dropped a pot. One of the line cooks peeked out from the kitchen pass, eyes wide. The manager's practiced charm faltered, his smile tightening as recognition warred with disbelief on his face. He saw in a single flash the shivering figure in a torn coat at the corner booth, and the man now standing in front of him with the presence that filled the room. "Good morning," the visitor said calmly, his voice steady, his gaze sweeping slowly across the diner. When his eyes settled on the manager, there was no warmth there, no nervousness, only a measured, quiet intensity that made the polished floors and spotless windows feel suddenly very, very small. The diner felt smaller than ever as Adrian stepped farther inside, the assistants hanging back while he let his gaze travel slowly across the room. The manager hurried forward with an outstretched hand and a smile that showed too many teeth. "Welcome, sir. We've been expecting you," he said, voice bright with rehearsed charm. Adrian took the handshake, but his eyes weren't really on him. They drifted past his shoulder to the corner booth beneath the plastic wreath. For a heartbeat, his face tightened with a memory that no one there but him could fully understand. "Yes," he murmured. "I remember this place." He walked the aisle between the booths, fingertips grazing the top of a freshly polished table, taking in the spotless windows, the rearranged decorations, the nervous stiffness in every server's shoulders. "You've clearly made changes," he observed, his tone unreadable. The manager kept pace at his side, eager and breathless. "We run a tight ship," he said quickly. "No slackers, no handouts. My team knows this is a business, not a shelter. We don't let people take advantage of us here." The words floated above the linoleum floor like a bad smell, impossible to mask with bleach and glass cleaner. Near the corner booth, Adrian stopped. He rested his hand on the back of the seat where he had once sat with snow dripping from his hair and hunger curling in his gut. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter but carrying further than any shout. "On Christmas morning," he began, "I came here alone, without a name, without a suit, without anything that would make me important to you." His eyes lifted to the manager's face. "I was cold, I was hungry, I was ignored by everyone, except one waitress who gave me the only breakfast she had." A murmur stuttered through the staff. Someone near the counter swallowed hard. From inside his jacket, Adrian drew a slim tablet and tapped the screen. One of the assistants stepped forward and tilted it so the manager and anyone close enough could see. Grainy footage appeared. A shivering man in a torn coat sliding into the corner booth. Servers walking past. Elena lifting her own plate and placing it carefully in front of him, her hand steadying his as he tried to eat. Then came the manager storming into frame, snatching the food away, shouting, firing her, sweeping the tip jar into his pocket as if it were nothing. In the silent diner, the only sound for a moment was the faint hum of the refrigerators and the echo of those actions replayed in everyone's memory. "That," Adrian said softly, eyes never leaving the manager, "is how you chose to represent my family's name." The manager's mouth opened and closed, color draining from his face. "She broke policy," he stammered. "I was protecting company assets. Adrian held up a hand, and the excuse died halfway out. "You stole from her. You humiliated her. You called me trash." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "Effective immediately, you are dismissed from this business, and this diner will not move forward under any leadership that punishes compassion." As the manager stood frozen, suddenly small in his expensive suit, a new question settled over the watching staff like a held breath. If justice had finally reached him, where would it find Eleanor next? 2 days later, Elena sat at her little kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, gone lukewarm, watching a line of sunlight crawl slowly across the worn linoleum. The bakery had offered her a few more shifts, enough to keep the worst fears at bay, but not enough to unknot the tightness in her chest when she looked at the stack of bills. Her son was at school, his backpack lighter than she wished it were, and the apartment felt too quiet without his small voice filling the corners. She traced the edge of his drawing on the wall, me and Mom in front of a bright house, and tried to remember what it felt like to believe that picture could be real. The knock at the door came sharp and unexpected, 3 precise raps that made her heart leap into her throat. For a moment she froze, bracing for the landlord's impatient face, or another notice slipped into her hands. When she finally opened the door, she found a woman standing in the hallway, dressed in a simple dark coat and a neat scarf, holding a leather folder against her chest. "Miss Elena Ortiz?" the woman asked, her voice professional but gentle. Elena nodded, fingers tightening on the doorknob. "Yes, is there a problem?" The woman shook her head. "No problem. Someone would like to meet with you. Transportation is arranged and you'll be brought back home. It concerns a potential employment opportunity." The car ride felt unreal, the city rolling past the window in a blur of brick buildings and bare trees. They drove to a part of town Elena rarely visited, where the sidewalks were smoother and the glass on the storefronts shone without cracks. The car stopped in front of a modest but elegant office building with a discreet logo on the door. One she recognized from the television, from that late-night news report about a man who had walked away from his own fortune for a while. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the lighting soft without being dim. The woman led her down a quiet hallway to a room with a wide window overlooking the town she knew so well. He was there, waiting at a simple table. No cameras, no crowd, no torn coat. Adrian stood as she entered, dressed in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. A navy jacket hung over the back of his chair. For a long second they just looked at each other, the noise of the city outside fading into something distant and unimportant. Elena saw the billionaire from the television, the shivering stranger from the diner, the man who had watched her through fogged glass as she stepped out into the snow with nothing. "It's you," she breathed, the words catching on a mix of disbelief and recognition. He nodded, a small, almost shy smile touching the corner of his mouth. "It's me," he said quietly, "though you met me on one of the worst days of my life." He gestured for her to sit and placed a plain white envelope on the table between them, treating it with a care that made it feel heavier than its size. "On Christmas morning," Adrian began, his voice low but steady, "I came to your diner to see if there was any kindness left in a world where I was no longer sure what was real. I had money in the bank, but nothing in my heart I could trust. You didn't know my name. You didn't owe me anything. But you gave me your breakfast and your dignity, and you let me feel human again." He slid the envelope toward her with slow, deliberate fingers. "I couldn't stop what happened to you that day, but I can decide what happens now." Inside the envelope, her trembling hands found two things: a short, clean contract with her name neatly typed at the top, offering a supervisor position at one of his company's new restaurants, and a small ring of keys attached to a metal tag engraved with an address she didn't recognize. The letters blurred as tears rose, the metal cool and unreal against her skin. "This is an apartment," Adrian explained softly. "Safe, warm, close to your son's school. Rent covered for the first year, after that at a rate you can manage. The job comes with training, benefits, and a promise. You will never be punished for treating people with the same kindness you showed me." Eleanor stared down at the keys resting in her open palm, her throat too tight for words, feeling the weight of a future she never dared to imagine pressing gently into her skin, waiting for her to close her fingers around it and say yes. Spring crept gently into the town, not with grand gestures, but with small mercies. A softer wind, a patch of green between the cracks in the sidewalk, sunlight that lingered a little longer on tired faces. Elena stood by the window of her new apartment, a real mug of hot coffee warming her hands, watching her son race across the courtyard towards school. His backpack no longer sagged with worn-out straps. His shoes no longer let in water when it rained. Light spilled across the floor, catching the framed drawing on the wall, me and Mom in front of a bright house, and for the first time she realized the picture now looked less like a dream and more like a mirror. Her days at the new restaurant were still long, but the tiredness felt different, cleaner, like the kind that follows honest work in a place that finally made sense. As shift supervisor, she walked the floor with quiet confidence, checking on servers, greeting regulars, noticing the people who sat alone a little too long. When a customer's hands shook as they counted coins, she found a way to make the meals stretch further without making them feel small. When a young server apologized for giving a free coffee to a crying stranger, Elena just smiled and said, "You did the right thing. We'll figure out the rest." Kindness wasn't a secret rebellion here. It was part of the job. Adrian came by now and then, not in a flurry of importance, but in a way that almost blended into the rhythm of the place. He sat at a corner table, sometimes with a laptop, sometimes with nothing but a cup of coffee and the quiet. Staff had learned his name slowly, not from headlines, but from the way he listened when they spoke. One evening after closing, as they stood near the door while the last lights dimmed, he looked at her and said, "The day you fed me, I was ready to believe that everything in my life was hollow. You gave me one honest moment. That's what I've been trying to build the rest of this on." She didn't answer with a speech or a thank you. She just reached out and squeezed his hand once, letting the silence carry more truth than words could. At home, the changes showed up in quiet, beautiful ways. Her son spread his schoolbooks across the table, not to count how many were falling apart, but to show her the pages he was proudest of. The scholarship fund Adrian had set up in her name covered tutoring and extra classes, and one afternoon he announced, eyes shining, that he wanted to be the kind of chef who makes sure nobody leaves hungry just because they're short $1. Elena laughed, then found herself wiping at her eyes when he wasn't looking, realizing that the simple breakfast she'd once given away was still feeding people she hadn't even met yet, through the choices her son was already beginning to make. Sometimes, late at night, she still thought of that plate on the diner floor, eggs scattered, toast smeared, bacon broken, her old life cracking open with it. For a long time, that memory had tasted like shame and fear. Now, when she closed her eyes, she saw something different, A tired woman who chose to be herself even when it cost her everything, and a broken man who found a reason to believe in people again because of it. She understood at last that true wealth doesn't begin in a bank. It begins in the courage to be kind when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.